Hello, I'm Michael Wiederman, and welcome to Mindful Professional Development. Today, I'd like to spend a few minutes sharing with you my thoughts about the importance of first impressions and how those first impressions end up evolving into a reputation, either my reputation at work or somebody else's reputation at work. And specifically, I'd like to focus on a couple of what they refer to as biases from psychology. That is, these are ways that our brains are wired to be biased in certain ways. And by biased, I don't mean necessarily making certain judgments, but the way we process information and the way we do form judgments end up leading us to be not optimal in that process. And so because it's part of our software, or part of our human makeup, then we're blind to it. We don't recognize it. It's just built into the way we make sense of the world. And it's also universal. It applies to everybody. And because we don't recognize it, it doesn't feel like it applies to us. But these are biases that are well researched by psychologists, have been known for decades. So we have to trust that indeed, even though it doesn't feel like it applies to me, it does actually, pertain to how I process information and make sense of the world. And the first such bias is referred to as anchoring. And the notion here is that we humans are hungry for data to begin building our story about a person or a situation. We're really motivated to make sense of the world and to try to figure other people out. And so when we get that first little bit of information, that becomes our kernel or our nucleus around which we start to build out the rest of the story. And so, of course, we're going to adjust that story as we get more information. But the problem, and the reason it's called an anchoring and a bias, is that we tend to focus too much on that initial bit of information. And it's hard for us to deviate very far from that first bit of information. In other words, it has an outsized influence on what we're going to think about this person or the situation as we get more information. And then this process of anchoring is further reinforced by another type of bias, which is confirmation bias. That is, our brains are wired to both notice and remember information that supports our beliefs. And so notice that once we have that little bit of information about a person, a situation, an organization, whatever the case might be, we're going to now unconsciously notice information that fits with that first impression and more likely to remember and build upon that first impression. So you can see why this is so important for the notion of reputation. Whatever we start off with in terms of a reaction to somebody or their reaction to us, unfortunately influences the reputation that evolves because we have too much emphasis on the first bit of feeling or information, but then it becomes self-fulfilling in the sense that we tend to remember and focus on and notice information and experiences we have that fit with that preconceived or preformed kind of impression. So again, there's that old adage about first impressions are so important. Now we see why, because of anchoring and confirmation bias. And so certainly when we are new to somebody or new to a situation, we want to be extra careful to manage our impression, to be as positive as possible, to present the kind of person that we believe we are and want the other person to see. If that somehow doesn't seem to be working because we're stressed or we got off on the wrong foot, then I think being as explicit as possible and sharing with the other person what you know about these biases and maybe expressing concern that, gosh, I worry sometimes, or I'm concerned that we got off on the wrong foot and that you may tend to have already formed an opinion of me as blah, 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 and try to sort of nip that in the bud to the extent that consciously we can override that by having that kind of conversation. Now, the same is true, of course, when we are meeting somebody new and forming an impression of them or an impression of a new situation, new organization, is to just recognize that our first experiences are going to tend to put us in a certain path. And so therefore trying to question those or look for disconfirming evidence, look for ways that maybe our first impressions, our first feelings are not necessarily reinforced and consciously try to balance out the scale a little bit by looking for some disconfirming information. So notice that when you put those two together, anchoring and confirmation bias, we end up with a set of goggles, a set of lenses that ends up coloring how we now experience that other person or the organization or the situation. And so again, just being consciously aware of that so that hopefully we can take some conscious steps to examine it, to hopefully correct for it to some degree, and to also recognize it in others and try to both be preemptive as well as reparative when we feel that maybe things have not gone as well as they could have. Well, thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.